Policemen, women of Reddit, what is the most horrifying situation you've been called to? I am not a cop, but the man I work for is a retired police officer. One day that will always stand out to him was when he got a call to go to a house when it sounded like gunshots went off. He came to the scene and entered the house. What he found was a man who he blew his own head off with a 12 gauge. That was horrific to him, but he later found in the house the man's children with holes in their back, as well as the man's wife with a hole in her back. The man killed his family and himself. He was stunned by it. The chief of police gave him the rest of the day off. Obligatory, not me, but my dad was a cop. He was the first responder to a grisly accident where a young girl speeding had struck 4 girls and flung them very far. 2 of the girls were DOA, and when my dad arrived, he saw that my sister was one of the girls hit. My sister survived, but was badly injured. He was on the force for 25 years and saw a lot of gruesome crap, but he still says that was the worst day he had in his career. Not my story, but my dad is a fireman. His first day they had to go to a call about a suicide. The lady was threatening to light her house on fire. When he finally went into the house with some other guys, they went to the top floor where she was standing in the middle of the room, doused in gasoline. She lit herself on fire and the flames swarmed her immediately. They saved her life, but her body was pretty fricked up. Turns out she did it all because her boyfriend broke up with her. I was in 11th grade and a local lady came to talk to our school about the dangers of drunk driving. To us kids who thought we already knew how bad drunk driving was, it sounded like this was a waste of time. The woman told us that her daughter had a flat tire and was calling her dad for help while pulled over on the side of the road. While talking to her dad, the phone suddenly went silent. A drunk driver had swerved his 18-wheeler off the road and hit her. The worst part? He hit her so hard that her head was found more than 200 yards away from her body. I sobbed like a baby. The assembly ended and we went to our next class, but I just couldn't stop crying. I left the room and walked back to the assembly hall, where I found the woman sitting in the dimly lit auditorium, packing away her stuff. I walked up to her, hugged her, and sobbed for a good 10 minutes. She cried. I cried. We just sat there crying. She told me that if only one person was convinced not to ever drive drunk, that speaking about her experience was worth it. From that day on, she came to every home football game I played for the rest of my high school experience. She wore my number, sat with my parents, and cheered us on. Win or lose, she always gave me a big hug at the end of each game. To this day, I never have, and never will, drive after drinking. Thank you. My uncle was killed by a drunk driver, and watching my grandfather cry over his adult son's casket as he calls him my baby is something I will never forget. Not me, but the absolute worst story I have ever heard and saw pictures of was one my instructor in the police academy told us. He just had us huddle in close and told us, want to hear the worst thing about our jobs? He was, still is, a sheriff's deputy and was responding to a car accident. Where we live, if a deputy is the first one on scene, that means the accident was way out in the middle of nowhere. And this one was. He said it took him a while to find it because the 2 cars involved had hit head on and their headlights were out. Finally he saw a guy covered in blood waving him down. It was the driver of the car that caused the accident, a black Tahoe. The driver had been drinking and had his whole family in the car. He said he was looking for his daughter. His girlfriend and 2 other kids had been strapped in and had minor injuries. The driver of the other car, who coincidentally, as they found out later, was also drunk, had a pretty bad gash, but was okay. But he and the Tahoe's driver couldn't find the oldest daughter, so the deputy, who was the only responder at the time, began searching. He was searching close to the wreck, but found nothing. He told us that finally the wind died down and he could hear what sounded like a kitten in a blender. It was the daughter. She was asleep in the car, unseat belted, and the accident launched her out of the car, off to the side of the road, and out into a field. She landed in barbed wire. There was a barbed wire fence on the property next to the accident and she went straight into it. Deputy took out his multi-tool with wire cutters, and each time he cut a piece of the barbed wire, the others would just get tighter. He got her out just as the fireman and first ambulance got there, and he ran with her in his arms to get her to them. Somewhere in the 30 or so feet he had to run. She died. I don't feel good. Firefighter here. Working with law enforcement, we got called for a suicide attempt. We have a 6'1" Russian woman in amazing shape that got hammered drunk and cut her left arm to shreds. We try to hold her down, but she is crazy strong, super flexible. So I am holding that bleeding left arm and my fingers slide into the open cuts of her arm. I have gloves on, but Jesus, it's creepy. As she twists her arms around it trying to get free, she starts screaming my victory will be glorious and cackling like some kinda satanic animal. So I'm struggling to get this arm tied down and suddenly she just stops, looks me dead in the face and says, "Where did you get those green eyes?" At this point she is on a stretcher with 6-8 cops and firefighters holding her down. Some of the cops don't have gloves on, so they don't want to mess with that bloody left arm. She slowly overcomes my strength and in slow motion reaches for my zipper of my pants. I can't stop her and my hands are covered in blood. She manages to unzip them, but I now have my butt up against the wall of the ambulance, so she can only get the tips of her fingers in my pants as she's straining to reach inside. We finally did get her tied down, but Jesus, it's one of my most memorable calls I've ever had. The cops said the same. I've gone on stuff way worse than this, but this always sticks in my mind as my fingers twisted around inside some lady's arm. Midway through this story I had to stop to check and make sure your username wasn't something like slowly becomes porn. Started as a ride along during the academy, summer of 2006. Had to complete a couple hundred hours. The academy was through a college, so they had slightly different requirements, but still got POST certified. Showed up to do the RAL and was immediately smiled at by the officer I rode with. Not a good sign. Come on man, let's go. This takes place in a small town in the potato state. Usually really quiet with the weekly drunk calls and some drugs too. This was different. We showed up to the already cordoned off house and walked in. There was blood everywhere. CSTs, CSI, had already been there and collected the stuff they needed to, so we didn't really have to be careful where we stepped, other than to preserve our own clothing shoes. We walked around the house and it was like someone had taken a paint roller with red paint and hit it with an air compressor. Red spatter in every room but the kitchen and dining room. The stench hadn't set in yet because it was just a short time prior. I later learned. We eventually made our way to the basement where the worst scene took place. It truly looked like tomato soup with rice in puddles on the floor and spatter on the wall. What happened? Husband found out the wife had been cheating on him, so he went to his buddy's house and asked to borrow his shotgun. He waited, had breakfast at a local restaurant, then went back home. He knocked on the door and the wife answered. He shot his wife, point blank in the chest. While Quentin Tarantino, SP, has it wrong with all the gore, it's still fairly close when it's point blank. He proceeded up the hallway and killed his kids in their rooms. The cheater confronted him in the hallway and he hit him point blank too. He then went to the basement, turned on the radio and shot himself in the head. I specifically mentioned turned on the radio because it was on softly as we entered the basement. I guess no reason to turn it off, so the CSTs didn't. I can't hear if you're going through Hack by Rodney Atkins without memories coming back. TL. DR first murder suicide scene. Won't eat tomato soup or listen to country ever again. Heck of a song for that situation though. One of my first weekends on my own. Got a call to assist EMS. Thinking no big deal. This is usually for extra hands or to help lift somebody. I get there and they say the door was open when they got there and the hallway is covered in blood. So I have to clear the house. As I enter the house, I notice the back door open and items from the house were on the back patio. Now I'm thinking home invasion. Call for backup and due to call volume 1 get told I have no backup. Just great. Now there are 2 directions to go. Right towards the garage or left down the bloody hall. Knowing my destined location was the bloody hall, I had to clear the rest of the house first. So I do so, and it's terrifying thinking someone could be in there. Worst part is, I can hear my victim screaming for help. But not a normal scream, like a painful, hot and muffled scream. By the time get to the end I find 2 locked doors. She's behind one of them, which could very well have the suspect as well, and the other I don't hear anything. So I end up kicking both in and only finding her. She was flayed open all over her body, still alive. We got her extracted and she survived. Come to find out this was a house used for migrant workers. 15 people lived in a 3-bedroom house. One of the guys got fired and came to the house looking for the boss but found my victim. He assaulted her with a machete, fled to Honduras directly after committing the act. I'll still never forget the screams or how much blood there was. And all as a rookie, lol. I got a welcome aboard look from my supervisor right afterwards. Not me, but my mom used to be an EMT, and a few years ago she got called to go check on a homeless guy someone thought was dead. They got there and turns out he was fine and awake except for his foot. It was being eaten by maggots, like fully covered in maggots with bones showing through. My dad and 2 uncles were called to pull a body out of a major river where we lived in the middle of winter. It was my grandfather's body. He had jumped off the bridge after losing his job during the recession. My one uncle threw up. The other one was immediately pulled to shore, and my dad tried to keep a straight face to help his brothers. But when we walked through our front door, I saw the biggest tough guy I know sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. They all say they've never felt anything more shocking, horrifying, or traumatizing than pulling their father's bluish purple body out of the river. I remember hearing stories during the recession similar to this, where a father who lost everything killed his family and himself, citing in a note that he did not want his children and wife to go through poverty. It's hearing stories like yours that I understand the injustice men feel about big bankers, AMD politicians getting off easy. My dad is a police officer. One of the stories he told me that has stuck with me was of a husband slitting his wife's throat. He used a bread knife and sawed his way through, in front of their grandchildren. I believe she survived the event but later died in hospital. How painful. I always imagined this being awful. Not me, but back in high school we would have an assembly where officers talk about the dangers of drunk driving, share gruesome images taken of accidents caused by drunk driving, etc. They would always have a Q&A afterwards, and someone would always ask what their worst story was. This officer would always share the same story. Starts out as a typical teen story where someone is drunk and causes an accident. Only this time the officer arrives on scene and finds a girl who's been ejected from the car and was basically cut in half, but somehow still alive. Of course she's scared and in shock, and asks if she's going to be okay, and of course he lies to her knowing that she's going to go at any moment. He sat with her even after she'd faded and waited until paramedics arrived because he knew this girl, and would have to tell his daughter that one of her closest friends had died that night. Not sure about the other students, but that story shook me up every time. It was fire dept rather than police. But here it goes. My dad and one of his best friends were volunteer firefighters in the 90s. My dad still is, 40 plus years active at the age of 63. His station got a run called in for a bad accident. A semi-truck fully loaded with sugar beets had run a red light and absolutely destroyed the Geo Metro that had entered the intersection. At this point in time, the way the call procedure was set up was that there was a designated group of guys who would go to the station to get the actual fire trucks, and the other guys would carry their turnout gear in their own vehicles and go straight to the scene. The intersection this accident occurred at happened to be the closest major intersection to both my house, as well as my dad's friend's house, so they were the first 2 guys on scene. Turned out that the woman who was driving the car that got hit was my dad's friend's mother. He arrived and found his own mom decapitated in what was left of her car. He quit the fire department shortly after that, and policy about going to the station first was revised as well. This story is about a friend of mine. Though he is a firefighter and not a police officer, a house was on fire and they managed to pull a woman out safely, but she started screaming that her kids were still inside, so my friend headed back into the house. After about 10 minutes of searching, he found the 2 kids huddled up in a closet on the 2nd story. He wrapped his arms around them in an attempt to pick them up, but their flesh fell off in his hands. He quit after that call. Hasn't been the same since. My oldest brother is a deputy sheriff. He went on a suicide call that he described to me as this guy who tried to start a 12 gauge shotgun. He described it as looking like a flower blooming from the neck up, with some teeth you could see. Now that's a creative phrase. Not police myself, but interacted with police on this one. Was sitting in my apartment very nearby to a major street in my town. At about 2 AM, I hear a massive crash sound from outside. and all the power in my building goes out instantly. I rush outside, and it's dead quiet, and pitch black. Street lights were all out. A ways off, I see the silhouette of a car wrapped around a telephone pole, and start walking toward it. About 50 or 60 feet from the car, in the middle of the road, I stumble across the driver's body. Right about this time, I'm trying to figure out what to do to help, and I feel like I'm going a bit crazy because something seems off about this body. A bunch of people from my apartment complex are running out to where I am right about this time, and I'm just stooped over the body, kind of in shock. A woman comes up behind me and starts screaming. Then someone else starts shouting at me, "Did you check for a pulse? Check for a pulse. Do something." It must have snapped me out of the shock, because as I'm searching for the person's neck, I realize there's no head. That's what was so off about the body. Still stooped, I look down the road a bit, and there's a person gently prodding something round and coconut sized with their foot. Head found. So I stand up and start to walk back to the sidewalk. The person yelling at me to check for a pulse is still raving, and I just take them by the shoulders and say, "There's no pulse, because there's no head." In hindsight, it wasn't very delicate of me to say it that way, so I head back to the sidewalk, and the fire department and cops are pulling up right about this time. Pretty quick response time, since we were very close to both stations. They ask who was first on the scene, and a few people pointed to me. They asked me if I found the body that way, and if I saw or heard anything useful for them. I told them simply that I didn't have anything to add that they couldn't plainly see for themselves, and asked if I could go back to my apartment. They were kind enough to let me without needing to take a statement or anything. At the time, I was dating a doctor who worked in emergency medicine, and when I spoke to her about it the next day, she was a bit concerned about how it was affecting me. I said that it was probably nothing compared to what she saw every day, and she said she agreed, but she knew that most normies don't see that stuff often. The whole ordeal just made me sad, and the idea that there are people who have to deal with it every day made me even sadder. God bless the folks who help us pick up the pieces after the horror. My husband is an officer. One time he was following another officer into a house. They had to beat down the door immediately upon entering. Gasoline covered them. Luckily, the flame ignition didn't work on the guy's booby trap, so pretty terrifying for me. I asked to only hear the nice stories about being a police officer after that one. Probably working the death of an 8-year-old little girl. She died from neglect and malnutrition. She only weighed 30 pounds. There's a lot more fricked up crap that happened with this case that I'd rather not go into. That's been the worst for me though. My 2-year-old weighs 30 pounds, if anyone needs a reference. I worked as a crime reporter in NYC car, 2010. I had a few very memorable nights. First night out, a guy had committed suicide by jumping off a 30-ish story building. Landed headfirst near a playground. Luckily at night, it was a mess. I teamed up with a local newspaper guy. I was TV. To collect facts. I was full of adrenaline, running around like crazy. The newspaper guy was a veteran of this crap. After 20 minutes or so he came back and said he left a note. He was depressed about losing his custody of his kids. His was just a waiter though, nobody important. I can't blame the other reporter in hindsight. You've got to be callous to do the job. I quit after less than a year. Suicide by subway. The body was in 3 separate pieces. It was taken out in 3 bags. Woman burned to death in her apt. Her upper torso literally looked like charred BBQ chicken. She was alive as they wheeled her out. The sounds she made struggling to breathe were freaking terrible. End on a positive note. I responded to a shooting outside of a barber shop. Tons of cops and a few detectives. We, newspaper guy and I, get our shots. Shell casings, emergency vehicles, street signs, etc. A civilian comes up to us and says, "Hey, there's a few drops of blood on the sidewalk over there." I tell a partelman and point out the spot. In no uncertain terms he calls me an idiot for showing him a ketchup splotch on the sidewalk. Partner and I follow the splotch, which keeps getting larger and larger and begins to grow into a boot print, which leads us into a multi-story tenement building. The elevator floor is covered with blood and the elevator is out of order. It's a hot day, so my partner and I look at each other and resign ourselves to hauling butt up the stairs. We hit the 3rd floor and the air reeks of pennies. Outside of an apartment door there is a towel, a boot, and a ton of blood. Just as we get there, a apartment starts jogging down the hall towards us to kick us out. We had us beaten NYPD to the scene, got our shots and left. Turns out the guy had been shot in the leg half, and rather than wait around for someone to try a second time, he hopped his butt to a family member's house, wrapped the wound, and called himself an ambulance. He was laid up in the hospital but came out just fine. My dad was a Garda, Irish police officer, and late one night he came across a hit and run, where a drunk driver had hit a bus carrying a lot of teenage students home from a trip. He came across it because they were checking out a creepy pink glow, which turned out to be the headlights that the blood had spilled into. In another instance, he had to sit in an ambulance with a body from a flaming car wreck, and for the hour-long drive he had to look at the bone sticking out of the guy's leg and said it put him off having roast lamb for years. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.